3.
Good morning. Thank you very much for coming to this session. My name's Professor Sonios Blandford. I'm really sorry that I can't be with you in Lithuania today. I hope that the conference will be a huge success and that this particular lecture will be stimulating and that you will be able to follow through as we go through the next 30 minutes, which will then lead to a discussion. So I have in my hand the slides which I will take you through. Hopefully they will be available to you in your pack, and hopefully they will also be presented alongside this video lecture. So the focus of this lecture this morning is aspiration, access and achievement, improving students' learning. So if we go to the first slide, we know that in practice, schools create a culture of high expectations for all pupils. And by all pupils, we mean those that are vulnerable, disadvantaged, those that have special educational needs, those that have disabilities. So all pupils is all pupils. And we do this by focusing very, very clearly on the aspirations of teachers, pupils and parents, creating access to learning by viewing what are the barriers for each pupil and how do we remove them, and focusing on achievement. And each of these three areas I'll be going into more detail as we go through the lecture. So if we move now to the next slide, the reflection on what achievement is in terms of the Achievement for All programme is as follows. Achievement for All programme is a whole school approach to raising aspiration, access, achievement of pupils identified with special educational needs and disabilities, the vulnerable and the disadvantaged. And this is based on significant research that began in 2009, which I'll go into detail. Now clearly in Lithuania you won't be starting the Achievement for All programme, so in effect this lecture is based on a national case study of the work that we've been doing in England and localised case studies of the work that we've been doing specifically in schools. And since September 2012 and from September 2013, our remit as an organisation, that's Achievement for All, the 3 A's, which stands for aspiration, access and achievement, is focused now on all vulnerable and disadvantaged pupils. So we have broadened our focus, we've broadened our remit, and we are now working based on our research for all vulnerable and disadvantaged pupils. And I'm hoping that this lecture today will help you in Lithuania to decide on how you will be able to help your pupils who are vulnerable and disadvantaged, but also to reflect on how this approach might be an approach that you take on for all your pupils in all of your schools. So if we move now to the next slide. So Achievement for All is not about reinventing the wheel. It's about redeploying resources and rethinking approaches. We know that wherever you are in the world, that there is good practice in terms of teaching. There is good practice in terms of learning. It's often the case that good teaching does relate to good learning, but in fact they're two separate areas of practice in schools. What we as an organisation and as a programme focus on is how to ensure that that good practice is available for all pupils. And in doing so, we're enabling teachers to gain, in terms of their own practice, gain the skills, gain and improve their approach to learning, and so they become learners, because that's a key factor in teachers becoming good practitioners. So if we move to the next slide. So we're raising aspirations, we're improving access and increasing achievement, the Achievement for All programme. And you're probably sat there saying, well, what is it? So it's not something that I can hand to you and say this is a book that you now follow from page 1 to page 100, and if you follow it, it's going to work. It's very much a bespoke way of working. It's a framework that is introduced to schools, and we've now introduced this in over 2,000 schools in England. So we're approaching 10% of all schools across the country, and in doing so we've been able to look at the most effective way of improving learning for all pupils. So the first focus in the framework is on leadership. Leadership in the classroom. So this must be emphasised. It's not whole school leadership on its own. Yes, that's important, but actually it begins in the classroom. All teachers are leaders. They are leaders of learning. So they will be leading in their classrooms. Teachers will also be part of teams, whether this is curriculum teams, or whether it's pastoral teams, or whether it's teams in terms of wider activities that happen within the school, within the local area, or nationally. So being part of a team is also part of the teacher's learning, as well as the way that pupils can improve their aspirations, access and achievement. And then there is school leadership. We know that there is an absolute case that school leaders are the pivotal influence in terms of raising achievement in schools. It's through them that the school develops its ethos and culture, and it's through them that we raise aspirations, improve access and increase achievement. And we've been working in England since 2009 with the National College for School Leadership, and we've been working on the development of a national professional qualification for headship, which is the NPQH. And there is now a module based on our work, Achievement for All, that all aspiring head teachers now follow, leading inclusion, Achievement for All. So leadership is an absolutely critical element in improving learning in schools. Teaching and learning, it's self-evident. Teaching and learning is also a critical element in improving learning in schools. And we begin with assessment and data tracking. We begin with the way in which we work with every single pupil, ensuring that they make even the smallest of gains in learning every lesson, every day, every week, every month, every year. And the importance of that data being owned by teachers is absolutely at the forefront of our work with teaching and learning. What is it that makes a child learn? What is it that ensures that they're going to make progress as they work through school? And again, it's not a handbook, it's an approach, it's an awareness of what each pupil is able to take on as they learn in schools. So just give you a little example. So in a primary school in London, 4 years ago, their achievements in terms of reading, writing and maths were nationally assessed to be around 53% of their pupils gaining and achieving the level that they should have achieved by the end of year 6, that's age 11. So age 11, only 53% were achieving what they should have achieved. By focusing on a very bespoke way with the pupils, we actually have now reached a point where 100% of those pupils are achieving. And this is a school where there's high level of English as a second language, high level of special educational needs. So very individually to a pupil, one pupil had not begun to learn to read. This pupil had no interest at all in the classroom, no interest at all in learning. Through our approach, through working with the parents, we learnt that although this child lived in the heart of London, they had a real interest in gardening, in working outdoors, in working with plants. So the teacher bought a set of very cheap plant pots, put the key words that child needed to learn on the plant pots, And as the child was planting his seeds, planting his plants, he was learning the key words. That began in 2009. By 2011, he was at the standard that was required nationally in reading and writing, and his maths had improved as well. And his attendance had improved, and his behaviour had improved. So that's an individual example. But collectively, understanding how children learn from the age of 5 through to the age of 16, understanding through the use of data, through conversations with parents, is absolutely key to what happens in the classroom. And we are introducing, as you are, a master's qualification. This is going to start from September 2013 in Achievement for All, and it will help our own teachers to learn themselves, because without teachers learning, what we have is pupils learning up to the point where teachers' knowledge can take them. So we need to ensure that teachers learn as well. The third element is parental engagement. This is meaningful engagement. We have devised, right at the beginning of the pilot and where we are now as a national organisation, a very strong focus on how to work with parents. And it is a joint partnership. It is working together with parents. It is about ensuring that there is a shared understanding of the goal setting for every pupil. And this has been hugely successful. Hopefully at the end of this film, you will be able to view a very brief film of our work, and in that you will see how the impact of working in parents has become very real in the lives of over 100,000 pupils in our country to date. Moving on, so the fourth element is the wider outcomes. It's really important that we see all four elements in an equal way. The wider outcomes focusing on behaviour, on attendance, on local delivery in partnership with other specialised organisations. We have various charitable trusts and various professional bodies that we work with to ensure that additional support that's needed in schools is actually channeled through us to the school. So the focus on behaviour, the Sutton Trust report that's come out this year and national reports on behaviour have demonstrated that there is an absolute relationship between improving attainment in the classroom improves behaviour, not the other way round. It's through attainment first, through children learning, they then behave. Success breeds success. If a child is able to succeed in every lesson, every day, every week, every month, every year, they will behave in schools. They will see the value in schools and they will value themselves, because as we know in behaviour, this begins with self-esteem. Attendance, very, very important that parents and children and teachers and school leaders are on the same page in terms of attendance. Why is it that children do not attend school? What is it that can be done? What can increase the access to learning by ensuring that the child is at school every day? And then the specialist help. There are occasions when there is a need for specialist help, although we've reduced that through the framework, so a child doesn't go behind a blue door or a red door for specialist help and miss out on the curriculum, but the child receives appropriate support focused on learning in the classroom. So we are a framework, Achievement for All is a framework that focuses on pupils, yes, those identified with special educational needs and disabilities, but it has absolutely a whole school impact. Everything we're doing can be transferred across the school and has been in very many cases, as you will see in the film. So if we move now to the next slide. So Achievement for All is a whole school focus on the 3 A's. Achievement is an outcome. Achievement is important, but it begins with aspirations. So at the bottom of that slide, its aspiration is about motivation. It's about orientation. It's about self-concept. It's about self-efficacy. So put quite straightforwardly, it's about self-belief. The child, the teacher, the leader, the parent believing that the child can learn. And the child saying, I have that belief. I have that self-confidence. I have the openness to learn in every lesson. And the way that we develop this is by developing their self-confidence in other ways. We develop it through sport, we develop it through music, through dance, through any range of activities. And again, this is where the wider outcomes come into play, because ensuring that the child has something, like the boy with his plants, has something that they can relate learning to. So the boy with the plant pots related it to his success in growing plants. The children who are good at sport, or the children who have access, they don't have to be absolutely perfect, elitist, good at sport, but engaging in sport, engaging in activities, developing their self-esteem. So it is the case that all children have to understand what their goals are. What are they aspiring to achieve? What inspiration can the adults around them, the parents, the teacher, the leader, and even their fellow pupils, their fellow peers in the school, what is it that the children can understand in terms of how to achieve their aspiration? To be motivated, not demotivated, to ensure that there's a lot of praise happening in their life, even when there's the slightest bit of gain happening in their learning. So part of this also is around access. So access, engaging in school, looking at those barriers that exclude them from learning, providing opportunities and participation. So do teachers in your schools, do they understand what makes learning difficult for these children? Do they understand how every child learns? Do they understand what they can do to ensure that every child in the classroom can learn? Recently, I observed some teaching that was absolutely fantastic. Small group teaching, where the adults in the room were able to take the children through step by step by step. This was 15 and 16-year-olds. What the point at that stage of education, it's often the case that schools think, actually, they don't need small group teaching. And again, going back to research that's been done recently by Durham University, by Steve Higgins and his colleagues, we do know that small group teaching throughout learning is absolutely critical to engaging pupils and providing access. So actually understanding what the barriers are, what makes that child want to learn. How do you ensure that that particular element in their makeup is reached? How do you ensure that every pupil has access to learning? Then achievement. Of course we want achievement in reading, writing, maths and other subjects. But it's not all about attainment. It's not all about the end result. Often schools will say, what our vision is that we have 100% of pupils to succeed at the statutory exam points, whether that's age 11 or age 16. Actually, schools are about a lot more than that. So experiencing success is absolutely critical to achievement, understanding what it is to achieve. In some cases, these children have never experienced success at school. They've only been told that they are number 28 or number 29 out of 30 in terms of ability within the class. Often, even the top pupils are not told on a regular basis, yes, you're good at reading, writing, maths, but you're also good because you're a kind person, which sounds very soft. But actually what we're building up here is, through learning, is the whole citizen for the future, and the ability for the pupil, for the child, to understand what learning is in the broadest sense, and progress. Progress is central to understanding learning. How is it we take those teaching and learning elements, the bit by bit by bit, the small steps, the learning that can be achieved in every lesson, how is it that we ensure that happening every day of the week? So, moving to the next slide, we asked the question in England, do we have high enough expectations for all children in England? Now, this is a question that you can ask in Lithuania. According to the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, we didn't have the right approach here in England. In fact, we've slipped down the league table. We are not, according to the assessment of 15-year-olds, we're not improving our reading, writing and maths and understanding of science, and this has slipped down over the last 3 years. However, having taken those figures and worked through them in the way that we're working with achievement for all schools, we are raising our aspirations and access. And how this is done, let's go through to the next slide, is absolutely putting aspirations and the raising of aspirations at the heart of our work. It's about high expectations. So if a child fails, it's not about keeping them at that level where they've failed. It's about ensuring that they can make those small steps in their next lesson. It's absolutely about a can-do mentality. It's not that the teacher says, well, that child has failed because they have problem A or problem B or problem C. It's that child can succeed because we know what makes that child learn. And it's the belief, as I mentioned earlier. We also want to ensure that pupils do not have low aspirations. And as I've mentioned, it's about engaging them in other activities where they can succeed or bringing those activities into the classroom, but also ensuring that they understand that there is a place with them within the world of learning, that they could go on to a college, they could go on to a university, they could go on to learn in the workplace. So they have something within them that enables them to relate what's happening within school to what might happen later when they leave school. But also to raise aspiration, to focus on attitudes, confidence of themselves, of the teachers, but also of the parents. So parents are motivated for their child. So parents understand that through learning, their child can benefit, not just in the immediate sense, but throughout life. And for schools and teachers to have a position where there is not a gap between those that can learn and those that can't, to ensure there is a closing of the gap that all children can learn. So moving to the next slide. So we have a very, very strong focus on access to learning, behaviour, participation in wider school life, parental engagement, developing positive relationships with others, and attendance. So what is it about their behaviour that's preventing them from learning? When you have conversations with the parent, with the child together, are you being positive about what can be done rather than what is wrong? We are in education, we have a tendency to focus on things that are problems. We problematise situations. That's part of being a teacher, is to understand what the problem is. But what we tend not to do is go to the next stage, is what's the solution? So the solution in terms of behaviour, what would enable that child to learn? What would enable that child to participate wider in school and the community? How can we get the parent involved in terms of them understanding what happens in the classroom and what happens in terms of the aspiration? And how can we ensure that the pupil isn't somebody who doesn't have a positive relationship with others? That's ensuring that their relationships is focused on learning. And attendance, as I've said before, unless a child is in school, they're not going to learn. So what are we doing about attendance? How do we ensure that their child comes to school for positive reasons, not negative? So if we move to the next slide, So our approach, the Achievement for All approach, is that we develop a culture in which all members have an aspirational outlook for pupils, regardless of the barriers that each of these pupils face, so that we understand that every child is a learner, that we're all learners, every human. That's one of the things that separates us from other mammals, other creatures, that we can take on learning and we can do something with it and we can apply it. And to improve the progress of individual pupils, schools develop a culture of high expectation, which is built into school systems and part of performance management for teachers. So how do we ensure that every teacher is accountable for every child every day? So every teacher is accountable on a daily basis for every single child they teach. Not just the end game, not just the outcomes, but on a daily basis. So if we move to the next slide. This is all determined by leaders and leadership. Improved achievement depends upon talented leadership. One explanation for this is that leadership serves as a catalyst for unleashing the potential capacities that already exist in the organisation. So in your schools, around you, you will have several people, 20s of people, 30s of people that have talent, that have the ability to teach, have that dedication. They went into teaching because they wanted to see pupils learn. It's about unleashing the potential, about ensuring that they have the capacity to be able to develop themselves, develop the teachers, and this is through leadership. And that there is a culture from the top and from the bottom and in the middle of the organisation that every pupil can achieve. So if we move to the next slide. So what happens in the classroom really, really counts for all pupils. There shouldn't be the separation of pupils into other groups outside, in the corridor, in other rooms. That every child in every classroom is the responsibility of every teacher. So it isn't about creating a structure or system whereby there's segregation. It is about including all pupils, but including them in a meaningful way. Not just having them in the classroom and saying, yes, they're there. Of course, that's part of what happens in terms of improving their learning, but what is actually happening with those pupils? So we should practice in schools distributed leadership, which is an emerging form of power distribution in schools which extends authority and influence to groups or individuals in a way which is at least partly contrary to hierarchical arrangements. So yes, there's going to be an element of leadership which is top down, but the bottom up and the middle are equally as important. Owning learning, owning aspiration, owning access, and owning achievement. So moving to the next slide. Schools need to be developed in a way that's a whole school approach through strategic planning, a real focus on vision, but not a vision that's 5 years hence, because nobody can actually see that, nobody can actually feel it, they don't own it. A vision that could be for a term, for 3 months, a vision that people can see, feel and experience. But in that strategic planning, as I mentioned before about policies, ensuring that every policy focuses on aspiration, access and achievement, and that the operational planning reflects this, so that in terms of what's happening in the classroom, the policies are then transformed in classroom. It's not transactional, it's transformational, so that classrooms become places that transform learning. Moving to the next slide. So leading inclusive schools that emphasise that in reality practice achievement for all, there's a real focus on a shared vision. Everybody owns a core set of values and beliefs. They're shared by all staff, that all children and young people have the right to opportunities to develop their learning. All pupils and all staff. That through that, there's a commitment to creating an ethos and culture of achievement across the whole school, a determination to secure the best provision for vulnerable children and young people, and to effective continuing professional development for staff. And by best provision, that isn't necessarily buying a set of books, although obviously books are important, but it's not buying a scheme. It's what happens with the teacher, what happens with the parents, what happens with the leaders, and above all, what happens with the learners, the children in the classroom. To collaborate with parents, children and young people and others within and beyond the school, including other schools, to develop and share best practice. You're sat here today listening to this lecture. You will have colleagues who have very good practice. You yourself will have good practice within your school. It's important that that's shared, and this National College research was based on the work that they did with us through Achievement for All. So moving to the next slide. So areas. Just to recap, developing a vision across the school for raising standards and closing the gap so that every child can succeed at every level within their education. Creativity and innovation. It's not about rigidity. It's not about ensuring that every scheme of work is covered. It's being creative and innovative. We're beyond the stage now in society where learning is linear. There is an element of linearity, but actually we are here, there and everywhere is learning. The World Wide Web, communication systems, learning happens in a variety of ways. That's for something for you to explore beyond this lecture. Building partnerships, as I've said and emphasised, with parents or carers, within the local community, with local businesses, with voluntary organisations, being a sense of the community, being part of the community, being with the community in developing the activities. And above all else, developing capacity, continuing professional development for staff, distributed leadership, and address the long and the short-term strategy. And the short-term strategy could be day by day by day, and monitoring the progress. So if we move to the next slide, good collaboration and communication means gathering accurate and timely data and sharing good practice. To improve target setting, so we're now coming down into what happens in the classroom. Improving the target setting. Is there a target for every single pupil? Do they know what it is? This would raise aspiration, access and achievement by engaging the pupils in their own learning. Improving lesson planning. Do you have lesson plans for every single lesson that actually focus on removing the barriers to learning? How is the lesson plan differentiated across the ability range within the school? And to improve and plan and implement practice, which is developed through the sharing of practice through continuing professional development. So if we move to the next slide. So I'm going to now come back into what we've been doing in England. Just to give you an example, a case study at national level, then at a local level. So in 2009, Brian Lamb, who is now the chair of our charity, he recommended that there needed to be changes in terms of how schools are supported in setting high aspirations for all, focusing on attainment, engaging parents and developing wider outcomes. That third bullet on the slide. If we move to the next slide, the Lamb inquiry then led and fed into a government green paper. That's a consultative paper that happens from time to time within government that enables the world, literally, to comment on how to improve certain areas of practice prior to legislation. So this green paper was entitled Support and Aspiration. It came out in March 2011 and we led the way. Achievement for All was very much at the forefront of developing the support and aspiration. And it was a new approach because it was focused on pupils achieving, not barriers. From there became a green paper which was a response to support and aspiration in May 2012. And again, we led the way, and the government recognised that there had been this real focus on vulnerable and disadvantaged pupils that had actually demonstrated gains. Then we had the launch of the Children and Families Bill, which was announced at the same time in May 2012, and we've since had the draft legislation of the Children and Families Bill. And within that draft document, which will become real in the coming weeks, it recommends that, if we go to the next slide, as the committee notes in its report, we are enabling all schools to benefit from the highly successful Achievement for All approach through our support of the Achievement for All 3A's charity, and we reflect the key features of that approach in the Code of Practice. And that came out in February, earlier this month. So, why is it that the government has recognised what we're doing? Why is it that we've been as successful? So Achievement for All, if we go to the next slide, Achievement for All was piloted in 10 local authorities right across the country in 454 schools. We had 454 schools at the beginning of the pilot, and we had 454 schools over 2 years later at the end of the pilot. We had 100% return on the investment. It was individually and collectively evaluated by the University of Manchester. So if we go to the next slide. So in November 2011, a report was published by the Department for Education, which focused on 28,000 pupils. They used quantitative information, data, clearly, as that's at the heart of what we do, but they also used qualitative data and information drawn from extensive interviews with school leaders, teachers, parents and students. If we move to the next slide. The key findings were this. If you compare the 28,000 pupils who identified with behavioural problems, with learning difficulties, with special educational needs, with the 1.1 million other pupils that were not engaged in the pilot but had similar difficulties, all of the 28,000 pupils achieved higher outcomes than that 1.1 million. So 28,000 pupils, through the Achievement for All programme, the gap was narrowed for all of those 28,000. In addition to that, we closed the gap in terms of English for 37% of those pupils. They not just closed the gap, but we went beyond that. They exceeded the outcomes for all pupils in English. So that was all of the population in schools. When you compare the 28,000, 37% of those 28,000 exceeded the outcomes for all pupils in reading and writing. And this was aged 5 to 16-year-olds. 42% achieved higher than expected outcomes for all pupils in maths. So they were quite dramatic, because it's not just narrowing the gap, which is the 28,000 compared to the 1.1 million, by placing those 28,000 above the 1.1 million. It's actually closing the gap and exceeding the outcomes for 37% in English and 42% in maths. There was also a considerable drop in persistent absenteeism. Attendance improved, and also a real improvement in the engagement of parents. So if we move to the next slide, following on from the needs analysis, what we do is we offer a bespoke 2-year programme to develop staff, develop pupils, develop relationships with parents and develop leadership. So it developed in partnership with schools and building on what works, if you remember the original slide. It's very much bespoke. We develop staff through training sessions. and through observations in the classroom. We have a structured conversation framework. We develop teaching and learning through a community of practice. We increase opportunities for the target children. We evaluate our outcomes, and then we extend and expand achievement for all pupils. So if we move to the next slide, so where are we now? So we began in September 2011, a complete blank canvas. We're now in over 1,500 schools across England, and it is right across England. And we're in primary schools, we're in secondary schools, we're in early years settings, we're also in those schools that are specialised for pupils with behavioural problems. Moving to the next point. So what are our findings after a year of refreshing, regeneration and increased activity? So we found that the structured conversations are a clear success, that personalised learning and teaching have developed, and that's very much at the heart of the teaching and learning, that the bespoke nature of the programme has been a clear advantage to schools. Many have reported how it has enabled them to address the very specific needs of staff, pupils and parents. So moving to the next slide. And our collaborative approach and our processes and practices enable that staff can be trained and disseminate good practice to other schools. So we're very much engaged in schools learning from other schools. That the data collection and tracking of pupils and attainment has enhanced in achievement for all schools. So there's been an enhancement of the data, an enhancement of the tracking, that pupil progress has improved. And through that, head teachers have become more effective in analysing data and being able to compare individual pupils, individual children with other children and groups with groups. And the focus on wider outcomes has really, really worked. So moving to the next slide. What is working well? And I should mention at this point that this evaluation has been carried out independently of the charity. It's been carried out by PricewaterhouseCoopers, an international global company that focuses on evaluations and has a major part to play in terms of achieving outcomes for the economy. So what is working well? Leadership. The programme has provided additional impetus for the school to focus on low attaining pupils at a whole school level. That leadership is driving forward effective systems to monitor pupil progress and the progress of particular interventions. So remember the words of Leithwood and Michael Fullen, we are systematising our work. That there's a sharp, if we move to the next slide, there's a sharp whole school focus on pupil progress. We use average point scores, but actually using data. So the improvement in tracking systems, data analysis and target setting are contributing positively to teaching and learning. So moving to the next slide, that we know that structured conversations are working well. There's effective links between the school and the home, enabling parents to have a deeper understanding of how their child can improve learning. And that some schools reported that this is perhaps having the greatest impact. What the University of Manchester would say and what we would say through PricewaterhouseCoopers is that all elements are important. Moving to the next slide, that additional activities have been put in place, and this results in happier and more confident pupils, and that the careful monitoring of the opportunities, and particularly through the world that's inhabited by the most vulnerable, and increasing access to activities has really, really helped in terms of learning. So moving to the next slide. So the particular combination of the four interdependent elements has had a huge, profound impact on outcomes for identified pupils and across the whole school. If we move to the next slide, I'm not going to read this, I'm just going to pause and give you the opportunity to read. So that slide clearly states it's the responsibility of every teacher. Moving to the next slide. So what the parents say. Again, I'm going to let you read and reflect. So it's that understanding, the shared goals, that's really, really important. So we move to the next slide. So unfortunately, in England a couple of summers ago, we had across the country some riots. They hit the global news, and the Riots, Communities and Victims panel looked at what was the cause, and they said it was poor parenting, lack of support, lack of understanding in terms of how these children had been educated. They'd been identified as special educational needs children in their schools, and that they'd been children that had fixed exclusions. They'd been children when they were at school, they were children who had behavioural problems. And what we're saying in working with the government is that by going to the heart of these problems, rather than just labelling the child, we can improve the outcomes through learning, improving aspiration, access and achievement. Moving to the next slide. And we have a significant number of looked after children, those in care, those who are fostered and those that are adopted. And I won't read all of this, I'll give you time to reflect. But in essence, a looked after child in a school has 3 times less opportunity to learn than any other child in that school, which is quite significant. It means they are isolated in terms of their ability to learn 3 times more than any other child. Moving to the next slide. So I'm now going to focus on a couple of case studies, so going into the individual schools. So this particular school, if we go to the next slide, so this is a junior school in Nottingham, a former mining area where the industry is no longer, where aspiration is at its lowest. And we focused on school improvement plan, which flagged up the problem with writing. We introduced more engaging, relative, creative curriculum. We targeted the underachieving groups, and we used the framework to improve not just those with special educational needs, but those across the school. Moving to the next slide. We carried out an analysis of data for each child, and we considered how well the leadership and the teachers and the parents knew how the child learned. We changed the approach within the school, and we focused it on progress, and that no child is forgotten. It's not we consciously forget children, it's just that we don't focus on all children. Moving to the next slide. We introduced a creative curriculum, made sure that every child was immersed in a topic before they were asked to write about it in literacy. So they did a particular focus on World War II. In that project, there was a real focus on literacy. They moved daily reading to the morning. A child is more awake in the morning than the afternoon. That was something that was not rocket science. It was a practical thing that could happen. And we also introduced guided reading and shared reading and independent reading. So a child's reading was staged, and the child understood what support they were getting till they became an independent reader. And we started using topics related to text as a basis for the response to text activities. So really focusing on literacy. So understanding what the text is, not using language that they couldn't understand. So moving to the next slide. So we widened their reading materials to include comic books, and factual books. So again, focusing on what the child could understand, not giving them something that automatically created the barrier. We really placed an emphasis on this, not just within this school, but beyond this school, not to take children out of lessons for additional support. During assemblies, when all the school gets together, to really focus on literacy and numeracy work, so systematising, ensuring that children knew that they were there to learn to read, write and understand maths. And if there were further intervention groups to increase learning, these happened in the afternoon, but in small group learning, not individually, small group learning. And we also introduced in the school workshops at tea time, so after school, providing tea, providing cakes, providing something that will enable children to feel as if they're part of the community, so that the parents could understand what was happening. Move to the next slide. Above all, there were high expectations for each child within that school. So moving to the next slide. So, moving to the outcomes, so pupils are now achieving, let's go to the third bullet point, level 5 in literacy. The expectation is level 4. So we've closed the gap, we've exceeded what the expectation is. So they have made considerable progress against the national expectations. If we move now to the next slide. This is in a different part of England, in the centre of England. Culloden's Castle is a business and enterprise school with over 1,500 pupils on roll. So we have a senior leader responsible for achievement for all. She also worked with the English teachers. And if we move to the next slide, she focused very much on wider outcomes, on attendance, behaviour, bullying, personal relationships and participation, and extracurricular activities. Moving to the next slide. The key challenges were that there were pupils that had real social difficulties. They were unable to learn because there was an absolute barrier to learning. There was one pupil extremely shy and reluctant to attend school. These were 11 and 12-year-olds. Another who was able to come into school and be sociable, but lacked confidence and actually lacked self-awareness, didn't know quite how they were behaving. Moving to the next slide. So this became a pupil-centred approach. So the teacher, who worked alongside the deputy head, focused on an ambassador programme starting with English. She recruited achievement for all pupils. So these pupils, the pupil A and pupil B, were recruited among a group of 8. Remember, it's not about individuals being separated or being labelled, it's creating that group. So she worked in terms of them becoming ambassadors. So move to the next slide. What did that mean? It meant meeting and greeting visitors and new pupils. It meant contributing to curriculum development. What were their ideas for English? Valuing their ideas. It meant these pupils went out and observed other English lessons and fed back to the pupils and to the teachers. So they were going through the lens of learning, they were understanding what was happening in other classrooms. And it also, they focused, this ambassador group, on introducing primary schools and then transition from primary through to secondary. So moving to the next slide. Again, I'm not going to read this. This is a reflection of the teacher. So school to school, these ambassadors are now sharing their practice with other schools. So what have been the outcomes for these individual pupils? Let's go to the next slide. So this child, pupil A, has improved. He's enthusiastic, he's engaging in drama, He's an independent learner. And above all else, he has a sense of purpose. So moving to the next slide. The other pupil, what she has is a sense of herself. If you remember, she had a problem with how she relates and related to others. She exceeded her target grades and has become far more reflective. She has a sense of pride and a sense of responsibility, and she represents the whole year group in English, so whole school transformation. So moving to the next slide, what we're very keen on is that pupils become involved in wider opportunities, that their self-esteem is improving, and this absolutely results in higher learning in the classroom and higher achievement. If we move to the next slide, so what does it actually look like if you were to engage us in your schools in Lithuania, which may be something that we look at in the future? We would be able to train your successful teachers in becoming achievement coaches. We'd also be able to train your school champions. We'd engage in a programme of school visits, and we'd ensure that there was a real training element that focused on whole schools engagement, that there would be a needs analysis, and of course the structured conversation. All future actions are then guided by the needs analysis. All of our work is very, very bespoke. So by way of conclusion, if we move to the next slide. So in summary, we've reached the point in the lecture when I really want you to reflect on your own practice. Really think about how you're raising aspirations, increasing access, and raising achievement in improving students' learning. What is it that you do on a daily basis, whatever your role is, as a policy maker, as a leader in a school, as a regional leader, as a teacher, as a parent, and for some of you, still engaged in learning, as a learner, but actually for all of you to become learners. What is it that you're doing for every pupil, every child, every lesson, every day, every week, every month, every year, to enhance their life chances through the 3 A's? What is it you're doing? And I'd like you to reflect on this last slide, which I will read. I think Achievement for All has enabled us to focus on narrowing the gap for the pupils rather than just supporting pupils. I think it has actually taken our good practice, challenged it, and made us take that step a bit further. And as I've said throughout this lecture, it is about step by step by step. We can work on this together, and I invite you to engage with Achievement for All, to engage with the framework, and to engage with us as a charity, Achievement for All 3 A's. As you move now to the rest of your day, the start of this will be a discussion post this lecture. Ask yourselves, what are you doing now? What are you doing to improve the practice in schools that enables every child to learn? Thank you very much for your time. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and hopefully sometime soon I will meet some of you, if not all of you. Thank you.